Good morning. Our Bible reading today is from Matthew 10, verse 40 to 42. Jesus said to the disciples, "Anyone who receives you receives me, and anyone who receives me receives the Father who sent me. If you receive a prophet as one who speaks for God, you'll be given the same reward as a prophet. And if you receive righteous people because of their righteousness, you'll be given a reward like theirs. And if you give even a cup of cold water to one of the least of my followers, you will surely be rewarded." So the title of the talk today is Ambassadors for Christ with a Cup of Cold Water. Have you ever been given a cup of cold water to someone? I remember once watching my niece running the marathon in Edinburgh. There were many people giving out water to the runners. Some were desperate and thankful, others just ran on by, perhaps to the next water station. Have you ever been really thirsty on a hot day and refused anything but water? If we're really thirsty, nothing beats water, though many of my friends might prefer a cup of tea. Jesus himself was once on a journey and was tired. He sat down by a well about midday, and he asked a Samaritan woman who'd come to draw water, "Will you give me a drink?" This led to a long conversation about living water, and that became more important than the drink of water from the well. In our reading today in Matthew 10, Jesus had been preparing the disciples for going out on a mission, and these were his final words. Here he is commending small acts of kindness that might just help someone else to keep going. In this example, he's talking about giving a cup of cold water to one of the least of his followers. We might be keen to support an important follower, thinking we might get something in return. But Jesus here is encouraging us to do this for one of the least of his followers. Our reward may not be in this life, but will be in heaven. During this time of lockdown, what small acts of kindness have we received, and what might we give? It could just be a text or a phone call, a chat to a neighbour, particularly if they're living alone. What many of us have at the moment is time. Let us use our time wisely, especially as so many don't have time. It almost seems to be a world of two opposites, those with loads of time and those with little or no spare time. How does Jesus want us to use our time? As Jesus' followers, we are his ambassadors. Jesus said to the disciples, "Anyone who receives you receives me, and anyone who receives me receives the Father who sent me." So our lives are not our own. We are his ambassadors for the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Over the last 2 Sundays, we've been hearing from Matthew 10, where Jesus sends the 12 disciples out on a mission. Up to this point, we read about Jesus' calling the first disciples, his teaching and his healing ministry. At the end of this time, Jesus speaks of the need for more workers. He's travelled throughout the country preaching and healing, and vast crowds had come out to see him. Jesus saw the crowds and had compassion on them, saying they were like sheep without a shepherd. He said to the disciples, "The harvest is great, but the workers are few," and said, "Pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest. Ask him to send more workers into the fields." Jesus then called the 12 disciples together, gave them authority to cast out evil spirits and to heal every kind of disease and illness, and then sent them out. So for the disciples, the time for action had come. In a way, they were to be their own answer to the prayer. Now is the time for action. They'd been well prepared. Do we sometimes respond to a need by saying or thinking, "Oh Lord, the need is great, send someone else," instead of saying, "Here I am, Lord, send me, use me"? I found the Message version of Matthew 10 helpful. It says, "We're intimately linked in this harvest work. Anyone who accepts what you do accepts me, the one who sent you. Anyone who accepts what I do accepts my Father who sent me." Accepting someone's help is as good as giving someone help. This is a large work I've called you into, but don't be overwhelmed by it. It's best to start small. Give a cool cup of water to someone who is thirsty, for instance. The smallest act of giving or receiving makes you a true apprentice. You won't lose out on a thing. So let us start where we are and start small. If the idea of being Christ's ambassador seems too much, perhaps we need to see ourselves instead as Christ's apprentices. Certainly this was true for the disciples, as this was the first time Jesus had sent them out on their own. They still had a lot to learn, and while Jesus was with them, they could learn from his example. But to a large extent, we learn by doing. When I was training to be a teacher, we had a few lectures about the theory of teaching and learning. But if we'd never gone to a classroom of noisy teenagers, it would have been pure theory. Of course, we could also learn by watching how other teachers handled a class, but in the end, the theory needed to be put into practice. And so what we believe in our hearts needs to be put into practice. In Proverbs 14 it says, "Whoever is kind to the needy honours God." Small acts of kindness can change lives. Earlier this week, a friend shared this post on Facebook, and I felt it was inspiring and a challenge to us as followers of Jesus. It's about someone called Sadio Mane, the Liverpool star from Senegal. Apparently he earns about $10.2 million a year. The article said Sadio had given the world a lesson in modesty after some fans spotted him carrying a cracked iPhone. His response was, "Why would I want 10 Ferraris, 20 diamond watches and 2 jet planes? What would that do for the world? I starved, I worked in the fields, I played barefoot, I didn't go to school. Now I can help people. I prefer to build schools and give poor people food and clothing. I've built schools and a stadium. We provide clothes, shoes and food for people in extreme poverty. In addition, I give €70 per month to all people from a very poor Senegalese region in order to contribute to their family economy. I do not need to display luxury cars, luxury homes, trips and even planes. I prefer that my people receive a little of what life has given me," Mane said. The challenge to us as followers of Jesus, his ambassadors, his apprentices, is to pass on and share what we've received from him. Jesus had begun by giving the disciples instructions about preaching the good news and healing the sick, and ends with commending the giving of a cup of cold water. It's not either or, but both and. Later on in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus tells the story of the parable of the sheep and the goats, who will be separated according to how they'd responded to the hungry, thirsty, poor, sick, and those in prison. The king in the parable said, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." So too in a commentary I read it said, "Even the simplest kindness shown to the most insignificant disciple of Christ, because he is a disciple of his, will be rewarded according to the merit of Christ himself." So as ambassadors of Christ, let us be ready not only to share the good news, but also through small acts of kindness, give a cup of cold water to those who are thirsty. As a final thought, many of you will have heard of Barnabas Fund, an aid agency for the persecuted church throughout the world. In their latest magazine, they mentioned that Barnabas Fund has fed more than 500,000 Christians in 32 countries in the first 2 months of the coronavirus crisis, including locust and flood-affected regions. So as Christ's ambassadors, let us not only share what we have with our friends and neighbours where we are, but further afield. After all, in the Great Commission, Jesus sent his disciples into all the world. Let us end with a prayer from CARE, which is Christian Action, Research and Education. Lord, please fill your people with your spirit of power and love to be worthy ambassadors of the kingdom, faithful in prayer, speaking truth, and loving those who are in need. Amen.